Hello, everybody, and even if you don't have a body. According to the analytics for the Integral Stage Author Series, maybe a third of our viewers are disembodied abstract entities, which is perfect for today's guest, friend of the show, Greg Kaminsky, who's here to discuss his new book, Celestial Intelligences. I would describe this text as one-third about the life of legendary Renaissance magus Pico de Mirandola, godfather of Western esotericism and neo-Platonic Christian Kabbalism. One-third general angelology and different views on the nature of spiritual entities and powers. And maybe one-third about the possibility that human beings, through various practices such as deep integrative philosophy, attunement, and emulation, could become like or even greater than the angels in our degree of being and understanding. So we're very happy he's back with us. Hi, Greg.
Hi, Layman. Wonderful to see you again. Thank you for having me.
Why do you love Pico de Mirandola so much? What's so intriguing about this guy?
I think, to me, growing up and as I got older and more interested in esoteric philosophy and practice, I found it confusing and interesting that Jewish mysticism somehow became the basis for Western esotericism. And it was even more confusing because, generally speaking, the Jews weren't well liked, and their religion, more or less, also not looked upon favorably by most Christians. So how in the world does this happen? So as I was getting my medieval studies degree in university, I was confronted with the fact that in order to graduate, I needed to write a thesis. And the way they described this process of writing the thesis, I quickly gathered that if the topic I was writing about wasn't completely fascinating to me, that I was not actually going to be able to do this. Not that I wouldn't do it well, I just wouldn't be able to do it at all. Yeah. So I figured, well, this may be a great opportunity to find the answer to how Kabbalism became so prominent. So I started out, we had to do a thesis proposal because they wouldn't just let you write about whatever you want because they've got to read it. And so they're going to limit what you can do because, it's their time too. And they want you to produce something that's beneficial, not only for yourself, but for the larger scholastic effort, if you will. So my initial proposal, which did at first get accepted, was really to write about sort of this journey of Jewish mysticism from Judaism into a sort of esoteric Christianity. And it was accepted. And then I had to then find a thesis advisor who would work with me personally to produce this thesis. And the person I figured that I wanted to work with was Dr. Kimberly Patton, and she was like comparative religion at Harvard Divinity School. So I met with her and she said, well, I'd consider working with you, but not on this topic that you've proposed here. She's like, this is way too broad. You're aiming for a thesis of roughly 200 pages, and looking at your idea, like, I don't see how you could possibly even begin to flesh this out in less than 500 to 1,000 pages. And I knew at that point that it was not viable. So she suggested that because her area of focus is angels in a large sense. And so she said, if you write about angels, I will be your thesis advisor, but you've got to find a very specific topic that's kind of narrowly defined and not overly broad. And so she looked through my proposal and she said, you write about this guy, Pico, and he seems interesting and he's interested in angels. What about him? I said, yeah, that'd be great. Why don't we do that? And it really worked out well, because it comes to turn out that Pico is actually the one key individual in this process who made this transition from Jewish mysticism to Christian mysticism possible, through his brilliant intellect, through his access to converted Kabbalists who were his tutors and translators. He was able to formulate a coherent proposal about the way that Kabbalism was from a monotheistic tradition. It's a living tradition. We have access to texts and practitioners. And so right off the bat, it was seen by Pico and several others as greater and more important, for those two reasons I mentioned, than Hermeticism, than the Greek mysteries, than anything else that you could possibly dig up out of the dirt. This wasn't buried yet. So they went for it. And they recognized that not only did Kabbalism, if you interpreted it in this particular way, proves, if you will, the truth of the Christian faith, the divinity of Jesus, of the entirety of the religion. And moreover, Pico felt that this Kabbalism, and by extension, what I would call practical Kabbalism, which he would call natural magic, was also a way to know that Christian religion was real, that God exists, that, you know, all of this is true in the most absolute sense. And that was, you know, very heretical at the time, and even today is not really a mainstream idea.
Okay, there's a lot of themes there I want to come back to, but maybe let's anchor this a little bit for people who are listening. So Pico's got this famous oration, which may or may not be exemplary of Renaissance attitudes, and it's part of a public declaration in which he's describing his unique synthesis of, you know, Plato and mystical Christianity and the multidimensionality of Kabbalism. So what's the circumstance? Like, what are the years? What's the circumstance? And what's his motive for, you know, professing these ideas?
Right. So let's give it all some context. So Pico was born to a noble Italian family outside the city or town of Moderna, and he was a genius. He would be what we would call a child prodigy. And he was recognized by his peers, by everyone around. They kind of knew this kid as an amazing talent. He knew, I think, like could read and write 6 languages, and was sent off to university to study canon law at age 14. And he studied all the classics, and he eventually fell in a little bit with this Florentine Academy, as we call it, that was headed by Marsilio Ficino, the priest who translated the Platonic writings as well as the Corpus Hermeticum. Although writers have, particularly Francis Yates, has kind of portrayed this relationship where it seems like Pico is kind of like being mentored by Ficino, like somehow Ficino is the authority figure, which would make sense based on their ages, because Ficino was in middle age, Pico was in his early 20s. But Pico did not look to Ficino as a mentor. He looked to Ficino as appear, but Pico believed himself and his own abilities to be superior, and that he knew truth better. And so at some point, Pico wrote up this 900 theses where he attempted to both comprehend and articulate the unity of all philosophical and religious traditions at once. And within these 900 theses, he did have these very controversial statements about Kabbalism being the way to know that the Christian religion's true, or that natural magic is similar. Practicing natural magic will allow you to know the same truth. So he wrote this up, and his idea was that he was going to debate these 900 theses at the Vatican in front of the church fathers and the Pope, and he would debate anyone who would debate him. And he would even pay their travel expenses to come to the Vatican to do this. Now, it's not explicit, but I believe strongly that Pico felt that the writing of this document, his ability to combine and syncretize really all of these ideas into a single whole, and then expound on it and prove it correct in the Vatican, in front of the Pope. I think he thought that if he could pull this off, it would be like a spiritual ascent while he was alive. Of course, the religious authorities were never, ever, ever going to go for this. They banned the book. They excommunicated Pico. They publicly proclaimed that this work was, forbidden and it was heretical, and anyone caught with a copy would be excommunicated. They burned all the books. And then Pico fled Rome, and he was captured on the road to Paris. And the Medici family was the most influential, powerful family in Florence, possibly all of Italy. And the Medici kind of stood up and said, if you release Pico to me, to my care, he won't be any more trouble to you. And so the Pope said, fine, of course, you take him, he's your problem now. And so Pico wrote what is termed an apologia for his 900 theses, although to think of it as an apology would be totally wrong, because what he's really doing is he's writing like a rationale, he's a justification, and he's not retracting anything really. And this document, the apologia, they excerpted part of it, and it's now has been posthumously entitled Oration on the Dignity of Man. And it's viewed by many as a declaration of Renaissance humanism. And I would say the reason for that is because people haven't actually read it. Maybe they've read like the first page, and where Pico talks about how humans are the most fortunate creatures in all of creation, because whatever we put our mind to, we can become. We can become like a plant. We can become like an animal if we just give in to all our desires. If we contemplate the divine or philosophy, we can ascend spiritually, even higher than the angels, as you mentioned at the beginning. And so this document, the oration, is really about the fact that there is and has always been a legitimate spiritual tradition that allows a human being to know divinity while alive. And he described this sort of, in a very high level overview, sort of the aspects of this, which would involve purification, knowing oneself, and then learning what devotion is and how to be devoted and what the divine is. And interestingly enough, as I investigated this, what Pico's talking about is exactly the same as every authentic spiritual path there is. But it's particularly precise with regard to the path of Jewish Kabbalism as expressed by the Hasidic masters. Again, which is really interesting to me because the Hasidic masters lived thousands of miles away, hundreds of years later. I doubt they'd ever even heard of Pico. But the tradition, the view, and the methods, and the results of that are beyond culture, time, and place, and they work. And it's fascinating to me. And Pico recognized it. He tried to share that with everyone who was interested. Some people picked up the thread, but most didn't, surprisingly enough.
The impression I got reading your book is that there's some, there's not necessarily scholarly consensus around the idea that the writing and public performance of this was an act of magic in itself. Some people would say yes, some people would say no. At the very least, this guy was taking a risk and I would think publicly invoking a lot of celestial intelligences right out in the open. That's a very interesting thing to try to do. And, is it your assessment that this was kind of an attempt to do an act of magic? And if so, did it work? Did he get something in addition to just public notoriety?
No, that's a good question. So I definitely think his intention was sort of an act of magic. Yes. Did it work? Well, in one sense, no, because he didn't actually get to do the thing that he was hoping to do or planning to do with this big debate in public. But I think in another sense, it kind of did work because he discovered like a true path to gain wisdom. You can clearly see it expressed in his writing about the way that, the philosopher comes to know himself and the world as like sort of discrete facts or bits of information. And he said, the longer you go on, the deeper you go in this process of learning, what happens is a sort of fracturing of reality into little tiny bits of information. And he said, but that is not really the correct way. We're trying to actually do the opposite. We're trying to gather all the disparate, discrete bits together so we can see it all as a single whole. And then I think on some level he realized, well, if I'm trying to see it as a whole, I have to actually stop seeing the parts. And so there's this process after the learning and the mastery of information and knowledge. Then there becomes the process of the contemplation and the unlearning, the unknowing, and sort of a transition from doing to being. But you can't be unless you can do. And this is something Gurdjieff expressed. And so Pico uncovered the same thing. And you have to be able to do by learning philosophy, learning about who you are, about what the world is, about what God is. And only then can we unlearn and unknow and then unbecome our identity, I guess you could say. And then we would assume our true identity, which would be participating in divine reality.
So for himself, it sounds like you're saying the work of creating a synthetic integrative wholeness of understanding was a step along his path towards being more.
Absolutely.
And it's very interesting for a guy to do that out in public. But there's another element to, or at least for me, and the text seems to contain a lot of suggestive, symbolic, and coded material. And that makes me wonder who the intended audience of that material was. Is he thinking of future generations that might dig up this treasure? Is he trying to send a signal to other esoteric schools and lineages that might resonate with things that he's discovered for himself? Who's the audience, especially of the encoded material?
That's a good question. So it's possible, like we could say, well, he must have been somehow trying to communicate to other Kabbalists who might read this and sort of discover these hidden aspects of his writing. That's certainly possible. What I would say is, I think what he was doing was trying to embed a structure and a meaning within his own writing. So his work would then, in several ways, be symbolically resonant with the thing that he was writing about. For instance, and I'm kind of talking around it, so people might not know what I'm actually trying to say, which is that Pico, when he wrote out his 900 Theses, he employed linguistic structure that mirrored a non-hierarchical kind of linear progression, or non-linear, meaning that his ideas and the way he expressed them, if you mapped them out graphically, would mirror the structure of the tree of life. So you had like two extremes and then a synthesis of them as a result. And then that could then branch out into other extremes, which could then be brought back into synthesis. So you have this linguistic structure that mirrors the aesthetic or graphical structure of the tree of life. And so to me, that was the true genius of what he was doing. Is he wasn't just saying the Kabbalah is the most sublime wisdom. He was actually taking kabbalistic aspects and then embedding them within his own work to make his work expressive of that truth too.
So there's an as above, so below kind of move going on here, where he's establishing a matrix that's going to be structurally resonant with the celestial intelligence layout of the cosmos.
Correct. So the idea would be, if we can actually structure our thoughts and the way we express them in the same way that reality itself is structured, then we'll be that much closer to sort of being in harmonic resonance with reality. And for Pico, and for, I think, any spiritual practitioner, they recognize that as the correct vectoral momentum for spiritual practice.
There's an interesting cultural question that comes up in this book around the idea that there's a Renaissance Christian presentation of Jewish mysticism. And the question is sort of, is Pico's work subverting Christianity by importing Kabbalistic thinking into it? Or is it appropriating and subordinating Kabbalah with Christianity? What's your take on that?
Well, I think it really depends on your perspective as to how you would answer that question. But for me, and I think the way Pico and his peers thought of it, it was that they were appropriating a mystical tradition from practitioners that couldn't or wouldn't recognize and appreciate its full importance. And so it should be taken from them and used in the proper way, which is not only as a foundation for Christian esotericism, but also as a weapon for conversion against Jews. So you get this sort of like double-edged sword, and it's truly bizarre to me. Like, you have this sublime spiritual tradition, it gets taken and then used appropriately in one sense, but then turned around and, used as a weapon against the very people you took it from. That's kind of fucked up. I'm sorry, that's not really an appropriate way of behaving, I don't think. But on some level, like, these people desperately needed some kind of authentic spiritual system, and they didn't have it. And they found one, and what are you just going to leave it there? Like, that doesn't make any sense. So it works. So they took it and they used it, and here we are.
Angelology is a very fun word to say. Today we sort of, I think, imagine angels as either, castrated do-gooders with fluffy wings, or as some terrifying elder race that's hard to tell apart from the demons. And yet when you read Pico's work, there's some ambiguity about whether angels are maybe thoughts or abstract qualities or something like that. What is your sense of what Pico is thinking of when he thinks of angels?
I think when Pico thinks of angels, number one, he's thinking that they're not entirely immaterial, that there's some aspect of them that's got to be material, or else how would they interact with us in our world? So that's the first thing. And then as soon as you get that little tendril, immediately you're like, well, if they're not totally immaterial, then why can't we improve our lot? Like, we're material, but if they are too, like, maybe there's a possibility we're not as stuck as we feel. And then I think there's an entire tradition involved around the subject of angels, whereby there's the idea that the universe has a certain intelligence to its design, seemingly, the way things seem to function, move. And so it was then kind of extrapolated that it's not just like a mechanism, that there are beings somehow responsible for this design, implementation of movement that we observe. And so then you get the idea that the angels are connected with the planets, with stars, with celestial bodies. So, like, how do they move? Well, the angels move them. That's a very simplistic, dumbed down kind of way of seeing it, but it's not entirely unrelated either. And then you have this idea that our thoughts are like angels. And this one, I think, is the most interesting to me, because they say that an angel can only have one function or one job. And this is the same as a thought. Like when we say a thought a thought is only about a single object. We like to say like we can multitask, but our thoughts are actually, if you examine them, which isn't altogether pleasant, you'll notice that the thoughts they seemingly come in groups, but each thought itself is individually discrete on a single object, and it can't split its attention. Otherwise, you have two thoughts, right? So it's the same with angels. If you have two jobs, you have two angels. You can't have one angel doing two jobs. It's just like a thought. So I think that is really fascinating. And then Pico proposed that if we emulate the behavior of and the activity of the angels, even if we don't fully understand it or are not perfect at it, if we practice this, it can transform us. So he said, first, we must emulate the cherubim because they're the angels associated with intelligence specifically. And if we emulate them, we will study philosophy and we will come to understand the world and ourselves. And once we understand the world and ourselves, we can then emulate the seraphim, who are like what is normally seen as the highest level of angels, because they're devoted to God, and that's all they do is devote themselves to God. And he said, it's only once one truly understands the world and themselves that you can even have any idea what God is. But once you know what God is, then you can be devoted. And then he said, then we emulate the order of angels called the thrones, because they act with proper judgment in the world. And once we know ourselves and we know the world and we know God, only then can we act appropriately from that knowing. And then in his 900 Theses, what Pico did was he rearranged the traditional order of angels. So he placed the cherubim at the top because they represent the pursuit of knowledge and intelligence, and Pico saw they're the most like us. He put them at the top because he wants humans to be as close to the divine as possible. And he knows it's possible. And so he's making a statement by reordering the traditional order of angels and saying that the cherubim are actually the most important because they're the ones we begin with. And they're the ones who actually allow us to have this sort of spiritual ascent. And that was, again, like another really wild innovation, like a very profound statement that Pico makes, and is completely in alignment with, what you might think of as like a perennial tradition, and completely in alignment with esoteric paths and traditions as we understand them today, as they've been taught since the beginning.
I think a lot of people who have spent time in spiritual disciplines and spiritual paths can relate to this idea that the most important thing is not the hypothetical goal, but your next step, the intermediary that helps you go to your next position. But when I'm listening to this, I'm thinking of Pico. Sounds like he's taking for granted that he's starting at the position of a sensible, sane adult human, and then we start up this ladder. And today, as modern people, we have a lot of studies on childhood, maturation phases. And I wonder what he would think about that. When someone's going from being an infant to a toddler, are they emulating the angel of toddlerness? Like, is there a similar ladder that gets you up to the level of the human who can start to work on the cherubim?
Yeah, I don't know. I never saw any consideration of that, really. it seemed like you're right. He was basically just saying, like, we start from the mature human level, and then, but then it requires that we sort of purify our mind, purify our thoughts and our actions, and then one would begin this sort of emulation.
Yeah.
And he talked, even in the oration, he talks about, one wouldn't approach Jacob's ladder to the heavens with dirty hands and feet. Like, you wouldn't grasp the Lord's ladder to climb up to heaven when you're covered in filth, metaphorically speaking. And that's true, because when one is in a state where they feel debased by their actions and behaviors, then it is impossible to be allowed to sort of come into the presence of the divine, and Pico expresses it, in order to be with the divine, you have to become like the divine. And there's no other way. And that's the whole point of the spiritual path. Like, we have to become more like the divine if we want to know the divine, because the divine, it's not like letting or not allowing. It's simply a function of how reality works. In order to know something, you have to sort of, like, walk a mile in the shoes. Like, it's the same thing. In order to truly know someone else, you have to kind of live their life. And in order to know God, you've got to live like God's life as best we understand it. And that's what every sage tells us.
I'm curious about how broad or specific the category of angels is here. Like, because sometimes we might think of them as a specific subset of all the kinds of subtle beings. There's angels, but there's also devils, and there's elves, and there's genies. Or are we thinking instead of angels as a generic class that includes all of the possible subtle beings, are some subset of angel?
Well, Pico doesn't really articulate that clearly, but I think it's fairly explicit in the writings, his writings, and sort of like the writings of the time, that angels specifically are subtle beings that serve God and serve God's plan. So I don't know that you would categorize other subtle beings as angels, or at least the Renaissance philosophers would, because I don't know that there would, like, if, for instance, elves, like, we don't really have the sense that elves are working to fulfill God's will particularly. So I would say those are a separate class of beings, and they're not sort of like divine beings in the same way that we would think of angels as being. So I think that would be a distinction, certainly. And then other classes of beings, from their perspective, you wouldn't even worry about, because you don't want anything to do with them.
So it sounds like there's these things that are like actions, but they're like nodes in a network, and they're also like entities, right? And they can act as if they're entities, but they're also sort of the doingnesses of the cosmos. And a subset of those are aligned toward a maximal condition, a God condition. And the ones that have that alignment are the ones that we're referring to as angels.
I would agree with that.
The dirty hands thing is interesting to me, because there are questions about, like, what's an impurity and what's just something that mortal biological forms share with celestial intelligences. Like, do angels have sex? Is that something that we have in common with them, or is that something that's only mortal and we leave that behind to move into the celestial? Like how similar are they to us?
Yeah, I think they're not similar to us.
Yeah.
Because their mind is single pointed, and so they don't have thoughts and they don't have desires, certainly. So yeah, any kind of passion, sex would and what would the purpose of it be for them? And I'm saying this like I don't actually know. Okay, so yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. The writings would make me believe that they are only interested in the divine, but the more you go into it, the more complex it gets, because in many traditions, the further you go into like the more esoteric aspects, sex for humans can be a method, a way to work towards gnosis. So yeah, I don't really know. I mean, it would be something I think that would be interesting to find out. I guess that's probably the best I could tell you.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Yeah, I find it a bit intriguing because sacred eroticism is an important thread in the tapestry of Western esotericism, which in many respects descends from Pico.
Yes.
Right. It makes me curious whether there is anything in Pico that suggests, the masculine and feminine, suggests how Eros is handled, or whether that's sort of all absent from those texts.
Yeah, I don't see anything in his writing specifically, but we know from his life story that, he certainly was an amorous youth. And I don't know, it's hard to say whether that translated into anything more than like biological imperative or true love, or like even a divine love expressed through love of others. I don't know. I mean, any and all of them are possible, but I don't see any discussion of it in his writing. It seems like when I read like the oration, the flavor feeling that comes through to me is a solitary, contemplative practitioner who is following what we would call the right-hand path of devotion.
If he was alive today and was aware of, imagery and literature, things of UFOs, would he think, oh, that's an example of angelology? Or would he think that's not what I'm talking about? I'm talking about something else.
Yeah, I think he would say that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about something else. And I'd say that because, like, in his mind, and in many religious people, like, there's a certain awe and sacred feelings that they would expect divine beings to generate. But I don't know. I think the disconnect for me, and I suspect for others, it comes in not in the respect that like lights in the sky, but when you actually see it up close, it looks incredibly technological. And on a very fundamental level, that doesn't seem to jive with our ideas of angels, at least even as a modern human.
This isn't necessarily about Pico, but I'm curious about your take on this, because there's a sort of conventional story of history where there were all these regional tribal peoples that were eventually subsumed into nations and kingdoms, where they were put under the rule of one book and one language and one law and one king. And we sort of see something like that in the archaeology of religious history, where the Tibetan Buddhists supposedly defeated the Himalayan sorcerers, and the Jesuit priest with the one book can drive out the pagan devils, and the only legitimate magic in Islam is what goes along with Allah's thing. So do we think, is your take that the ancient pantheons of celestial intelligences were originally organized around a one, like inherently around a one, or that there was a shift and a one came to dominate and organize a bunch of these plural entities, or that maybe that never happened and the sense of unity is sort of a cultural imposition? I don't know. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a question I don't think we can actually know the answer to, but the way I would think of it is probably more along the lines of like Schelling with his ideas about time. I think he expressed it in his essay on the gods of Samothrace, this idea that it's not a top-down imperative. What he's describing is a bottom-up organic growth where, and this mirrors our own spiritual path in many ways. Like we were talking earlier about this idea of like, first you have to come to know all the things, and only then can you turn to unlearn thingness itself. So this is similar, right? And we start with a multitude, right? There's many deities and sublime beings and even worldly beings with powers, and as one gains favor, one sort of ascends, and as one ascends, the whole structure of reality is seemingly doing the same thing, and then you've got more and more unification as we go, both through time and through, I guess you would call a spiritual maturation, whether that's culturally, society, individually, or as a human species. And that's not to say that the revelation of like the one God is the final stop on this path, because I don't actually think it is. That's not to say that there is no divine either, because there clearly is divinity. But I think the development of our own collective understanding about what is the divine and how we fit into that grows and matures, and as we do. And I don't know that I could really express it any more clearly than that. And I wish it was more clear, because I feel like there's something really there, but I have trouble expressing it. Probably because I'm not at the place where I know divinity. Maybe if I knew divinity, I could express it very clearly. I don't know.
I think that might be true, but also it seems to me that very few people have even tried to express such things. So it might be that it's it's a very open, tangled field of knowing.
But I mean, if people want to know more about that specifically, I would say definitely read Schelling's essay on the gods of Samothrace, because at the end of it, in a very long paragraph with a massive run-on sentence, he expresses this very idea, and it makes sense to me when you think about sort of ancient religions and the way that they had their deities, but they clearly recognize sort of like the divine wholeness of everything. And I feel like to not see that and know that is like to cast our ancestors as like simpletons who couldn't somehow appreciate the truth, which I don't get that sense from them.
I agree with that. And I think there's been the distinction has been exaggerated by some of the monotheists.
Mm-hmm.
Pico and also a lot of the alchemists make it very ambiguous what the relationship between nature, magic, and science is. Right. So, is natural magic more like proto-science? Is it more like a different kind of science? Or is it more like a combination of sciences?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think part of the answer has to include the fact that when Pico lived and wrote, there was no such thing as science as we understand it. The method of science hadn't been invented at that point, or at least expressed and articulated and accepted as a standard. So how did they think of natural magic? Yeah, I think it was a hidden but valid way to know reality and to work with reality and to work with, divine beings. But it certainly wouldn't have served the same purpose as science does for us, other than to know more about the world. And then, because the natural magic Pico is talking about is not designed to alter circumstances.
Right.
So if you're talking about magic that is like sorceries designed to like change your everyday circumstances, that would be more like the intention of science, I think, in some ways, where it's like a practical science. Like, we need to know this in order to improve our conditions. And so you could see that, I think, but maybe you could say natural magic is analogous to science in the sense that, science is a method for us to try to know the truth. And so in that way, I guess you could say natural magic and science are similar.
Yeah, I guess we might say that it's trying to alter one particular condition, which is this one.
Yes. Yeah. Our delusion. Yeah, definitely. To transform our perception.
Pico's, his approach is fascinating. It's integrative, syncretic, synthetic, however we want to phrase that. And that flavor descends into Western alchemical and esoteric thought for centuries. How did he go about doing it? What was his strategy for syncretism? How did he think disparate perspectives and systems could be brought together effectively?
I think on some level, he had the understanding that all reality was a single whole. And if that's the basis for where we're starting this investigation, then if all reality is actually a single whole and always has been, then we can know if there are authentic philosophical and religious traditions. And when I say authentic, I mean they're designed to bring one closer to the divine. And when I say designed, I mean designed by the divine, not by human beings. And so we'd have to say that even though the traditions are different and have their idiosyncrasies, the ultimate purpose of them is the same, and they come from the same source. And so on that level, the idea of the traditionalists about there being a single perennial tradition is correct in the sense that all philosophies and religions do come from the same source and are trying to return us to that source. And I think he felt that if they all came from the same place and were trying to take us back to that place, that it was possible as a living human to comprehend and appreciate the unity of all of these disparate, discrete traditions as a single whole, as aspects of a jewel. And so that's what he tried to do. And so you see in his writings this idea of trying to create like almost systems of correspondences or equivalencies, like, you know, powers in the Orphic system are similar to thrones in the angelic orders. And so in that way, Pico was trying to say like other sublime beings are equivalent or are angels. I don't know. But that's how he saw it. And that's how he was trying to really bring it all together and to see it as a single whole from an intellectual perspective. I don't know if he realized that there was value in doing it intellectually because we have a bit more control over it. Whereas typically, if a spiritual practitioner experiences a moment of unity, it's often seen as like the result of doing a practice, being dedicated to doing a practice regularly. But with Pico, he's saying you start this process in your own mind. And you can start it intellectually. And he's right. So we start where we are in that sense. And so this is what he's describing is available pretty much for anybody who even picks up the book. You start where you are, you kind of intellectually think about the unity. And then the thinking about the unity can generate feelings in your body. And then you explore those feelings while still holding this idea and allow it to carry you wherever it leads. And where it leads ultimately is this experience of divinity, which feels like wholeness, sacredness, holiness. I mean, all the words that we would use, that's what it feels like. And that's the state of being that this sort of contemplation leads one into. And so it is possible to start intellectually and end up like existentially in a completely different state of being. And I think that that's really the contemplative process. And that's how Pico, I think, probably experienced it. And that's how it seems as he's describing it in his work.
Something I like about that involves taking seriously the position of the recipient of the signal that you're sending, right? Because you could easily say to the reader of a book, listen, your mind can't do it. Words are not the truth. Abandon all of that. But at the same time, you're communicating to the reader of a book who's using their mind. So it might be the smart thing to say, look, this is where you are. You're reading a book. You're using your mind. You're dealing with words. Start there, and we'll begin a ladder on which that is the first step.
Yeah, for sure. And Pico, you have to understand, if you haven't read the oration, you should, because the way he expresses these ideas is really sublime, and he's like inspiring the reader to like take up the way, and it's very powerful language. And I think simply the emotion, the emotive quality that he's transmitting in the text is fuel for that path. And I think it would be impossible for someone to miss that. And if they missed it in reading it, then they probably don't have any hope of actually doing the thing anyway. So
you mentioned a teacher who may or may not have been a mentor for Pico. And I'm curious if you have a sense of who his other, like who were his sources or heroes, or, you know, who did he think was a successful example of what he was trying to do?
yeah, that's hard to say exactly because Pico doesn't really name his influences at all. But I believe that the primary influence was a Kabbalist named Joseph Gikatia. And I think he had a text called Gates of Light. And there's a lot of similarities in the way that Pico expressed his Kabbalistic ideas in his 900 Theses and the writings of Gikatia. As far as I can tell, I'm not really, I don't think, qualified enough to really make any pronouncements on that, but that's my sense.
Earlier, you mentioned a phrase that you use several times in the book, and it's a great phrase, nonlinear hierarchical models. Maybe you could explain what it is that you're pointing towards when you use that phrase.
Yeah, when I use that phrase, I'm talking about the Kabbalistic tree of life, the Eitz Chaim. And I'm using that phrase because originally this book was a thesis that was, the intended readership was a bunch of academics who don't know anything about the Kabbalah or angels or Pico or the Renaissance philosophy or any of it. So I had to try to explain this structure in language that was not too much woo, and yet would convey exactly what I was trying to communicate about the structure of it. And so I just figured that was the simplest way to say it. It's a non-linear hierarchical structure, and it kind of takes it out of, you know, is it a graphic representation? Is it done through the use of words? Like, yes, it can be however you want. So I think that was also the intention, to kind of like one step removed from the actual image of the tree of life that for most of us, like as soon as I say that, like it pops in your head and you see it. And these people, I knew that wasn't possible. So I had to figure out another way to like try to invoke that idea in their minds.
I'm thinking of people listening to this who come out of an integral theory background asking, why are you talking to Greg about this other than the fact that you like Greg? And I just want to reassert the idea that we're talking about an integrative thinker with a stage-based developmental maturation path who's dealing with a distributed, multidimensional cosmic hierarchy. And if they put that together, that's very similar to a lot of, you know, advanced integrative philosophies that we have today.
Mm-hmm. That's very cool.
Now, here's an interesting question for me, which is a recurring motif in contemporary Western esotericism is this notion of a new eon or a new age, a sense that there's either been an emergence in or a shift in the way that celestial intelligences pertaining directly to culture and technology are arranged. Do you think it's fair to say that certain angels govern certain epochs, or that there's something like an equinox of the gods or a movement in terms of the network of angels?
That's a really interesting question. And it's not as easy or straightforward to think about as one might suspect. I mean, superficially, it would be fairly easy, but when I really get into thinking about it, it confusing because like on one level, like time, like we perceive time, right? But we also perceive space and motion. And time essentially is motion through space. That's what's being measured. Okay, so, and then we have to take like a slight detour. So when we think about the like gnosis, like if a person's in that state, right, there is no time, there's no space, and there's no motion in it, in the sense of thought moving. It's not happening. So I'm left feeling, confused. Like I really couldn't even answer the question because, like, even from my own experience, I know that state of gnosis is more real than our everyday experience. And from that perspective, I don't know. What do you think?
When you stand in the position of history, it definitely looks like there are these phases or flavors. And I don't see why something like celestial intelligences wouldn't play a role in organizing that. If it's a circular set of changes, like the way we perceive the zodiac or something like that, then obviously you could stand at the center of that wheel and it would seem like nothing's changing for you. So that's one way to shortcut the option. It's harder, I think, to say if there's something truly new, if emergence, if the universe doesn't contain only what it's always contained, but also surprises itself with new things, then I'm not sure how we negotiate that, except to say that being and becoming are somehow intrinsically convergent.
I mean, on one level, I would say, like, it clearly, like, circumstances change, technology changes. Yes. But on another level, like, fundamentally, nothing's really changed. Like, human beings are still human beings. We think and act in the same ways we always have, as far as I can tell, despite, like, we have some extra gadgets now, and life's probably a lot easier than it used to be. But, like, has anything, like, fundamentally changed about being human? And that's where I'm like, I don't think so. I don't think it has.
It's a great question because it's very hard to existentially nothing's changed in the sense that our relationship to changingness is constant.
Correct.
We don't know how different, like if our ancestors had slightly more DMT versus serotonin in their brains, that might have made a huge difference, right? And I don't know if 500 or 5,000 years ago, a tiny thing I can't tell made a huge difference.
Yeah, I completely.
I feel like we exaggerate when we tell ourselves stories about change, right? On the other hand, we can now alter people's genes in labs, which means the fundamental nature of what's human can be beginning to change dramatically right now in history.
Yeah, that's true. Those are both true at the same time.
Something else that's interesting about this moment of history is our sense of that the whole system is precarious and accelerating toward convergent crises, right? That's either real or we feel it's real, one of those two things.
Yes.
And, do you think there's a chance that the reason that that's the case, or we feel it to be the case, is because we're out of resonance with celestial intelligences that specifically pertain to nature and the organization of the world, that we're not being good enough, we're failing as shamans, right? We're not establishing the resonances we would need for our world space to feel secure.
I think that's true. And I think there's another aspect to it, which is we've got this ubiquitous, imposing system of media, information, the internet, people who want to tell us how things are and what we should think about them and how we should act based on that. And I think you're right, like we're not really fully in tune with our environment. Absolutely correct. But we are putting ourselves under the spell of this media that mostly wants to make us angry and afraid. Because angry and afraid people click more and they buy more and they are easy to provoke in whatever way you want. So I feel like if we were able to break the spell of that, it would go a long way towards reestablishing some balance and harmony and equanimity within ourselves and within our world. But that's just not going to happen. I hate to say it, it's just not going to happen because the media is like a drug. They've figured out a way to make it addictive. And when you've made information addictive, it's a problem because people legitimately feel like they need to know what's going on in order to operate in their environment. So I don't really know how we fix this or if it's a fixable situation. It might be simply people decide on their own, I need a break from this. I'm turning off the computer. I'm turning off my phone. I'm going for a walk and I'm leaving it behind. And then we can reach some sense of peace. But I think when we're constantly bombarded by messages that want to cause us to feel anxious, afraid, angry, we're just not strong enough internally within ourselves to be able to fully resist that all the time. And the result is the world we see around us.
I can imagine people having mixed feelings about the idea of a spiritual path that begins in the intellect, right? That might sound like a Faustian hubris, right? The attempt of the intellect to pretend it can become God. And yet there's this tradition from Pico, and there's an intellectual yoga in India. And, you know, by some definitions of prajna, that might be a form of higher intellect that merges with samadhi at some point. Do you think it's more dangerous or more appropriate to have a spiritual path of mind?
It's a good question. So in Buddhism, we're taught that the Buddhas arise in accord with the needs of beings. So if you have a spiritual path that is primarily intellectual, there must be some people that require that type of path in order to make progress, right? I mean, that would be the implication of, you know, Buddhas arise in accord with the needs of beings. So if I accept that as my axiom, then my hypothesis is that yes, you have to have all the different types of paths because we have all the different types of people. And so if you have an intellectual person who wants to know God, then we have a way for them to do that. And that's great. It's wonderful that every person could find a method that works for them, I think. Because we're not all the same. we have fundamental similarities, but we also are very different in the way that those similarities are expressed. So my teacher always says, like, the spiritual path is not like a Ford assembly plant. We're not building a car. A person is a dynamic living process. And so each one is slightly different. And if we have a spiritual path that is actually responsive to our needs, then it will be made so we can actually do it. And that's wonderful. And so that is something people should be aware of. There are legitimate methods that will work no matter what type of person you are. There are spiritual methods that work and are possible to practice, whether you're the most intellectual person or a person, who's not intellectual at all, but extremely devoted, or a person who enjoys, working with their body. There's ways for everyone.
Well, you're saying that, I think of maybe two different types of intellectual approaches. And I'm reminded of a story I heard once that Pythagoras drowned a man for asserting irrational numbers or something like that, right? So there's this idea that all the celestial hierarchy is arranged in these definitive structures like the number line. And when someone comes along and wants to talk about the square root of -1, or the fact that you're never going to find the end of pi and it's never going to make sense to you when you go down those digital nonlinear paths. I'm curious maybe about Pico, because the Renaissance is a time where the notion of reason starts to become valorized. And is he thinking of all of these celestial intelligence as fundamentally and discretely knowable? Or are there celestial intelligences that you can approach with your intellect, but by their very nature, they're unknowable or unintelligible? They're like a pattern, some kind of nonlinear computational pattern that you can never get on top of. You can encounter it, but you're never going to know it like the number 3 or the number 7.
Yeah, so this is where I think the words of Meister Eckhart are very applicable. And what he basically expressed is that you cannot know God, or you cannot know divinity, but you can be God. You can become God, but you can't know it, because to know it requires you and the thing you're knowing. And if we're talking about divinity, because we are participating in that, you can't know it as something separate from yourself, but you can be it, and you can know that you're being it. That is possible. So that, I think that's really the crux of it, is that they try to express the reality in ways that are definable. But we know that the divine is not knowable, is not, you can't express it, you can't know it. And so these descriptions, whether they're maps, models, spiritual paths, methods, they're not really true. Because truth, like I said, can't be known, can't be expressed. It's like, trying to think of sorry, I'm blanking out. Nisargadatta Maharaj has a lot of good things to say on this idea.
You're making me think of a time I was a kid and there was a rainbow, and I thought, I'm going to get to the bottom of this, whether there's a pot of gold thing out there. So I set out to get to the rainbow, but obviously when you get close enough, your angle of perceiving the refraction of the light changes, right? So you can get to where the rainbow comes down to the earth, but you can't see it from there. As soon as you're close enough, it's gone. It's not as there as an object of perception anymore.
It's not real in that way.
Yeah.
But yet there it is.
So over the course of his life, did Pico become inwardly like an angel, despite the limitations of his external flesh? Did he succeed along his path?
That's a good question. I really don't know. What I do know is that Pico was murdered, assassinated at age 31, I believe, and his heirs tried to make it seem like in his youth, he was wild and exuberant and irrational and made some bad choices. But as he grew up and matured, he became a pious Christian, and that was the end of that. But if you actually read his works, even his later works, it is quite obvious to anyone with any real sense that he never renounced his views. I think what he did was he became more skilled at hiding and embedding them within his texts, which superficially were, just about straightforward religious or philosophical themes. But just below the surface, if you even think about what he's saying, it's clear that he's just along the same lines that he started out on. So Pico kind of played this game where he knew he couldn't be open about what he really thought, but he wasn't going to completely hide it either. He would hide it in a way so that those who knew would be able to see it and those who didn't wouldn't. Now, he was assassinated, so you could argue like he didn't hide it well enough. That may be true. But he was also playing other games, like the Dominican friar Savonarola, who was prominent in Florence at the time, kept after Pico to join the Dominican order, his order. And Pico kept yesing him to death. Like, oh yeah, I'll do it. Never did it. When Pico was buried, they buried him in the habit of the Dominican order. So they imposed the rule upon him in death that they couldn't get him to submit to while he was alive.
Do we have any remarks about him from other people at the time? Does Machiavelli or anybody else like in that time period have anything to say about this guy?
There have been. The one remark that stands out was, I forget who, but they basically proclaimed him the phoenix of the age, that he alone was the most shining example of intellect at the time, like a shooting star, that no one could really, stand on the same stage as him because he was that bright. But as we know, when shooting stars, they burn brightly and they burn fast, and then they're done. And that's exactly what happened with Pico.
We were talking earlier about this sense that maybe angels are so unique and single purpose that it makes no sense to think of groups of angels or types of angels because each one is so specific. And maybe Pico is like this. Maybe he's just such a rare phenomenon. But on the other hand, maybe there's things in Pico that people can learn from that could become a tradition, that even if he wasn't saying, here are practices you can do, there might be a way to turn his principles into practices. What would you say to someone who said, how could I try out, how could I experiment with Pico's understandings and see if they work for me?
That's a great question. And I think you're right. You're onto something there, that is eminently possible to do that. Because if you take his oration, it would be easy to see the path that he's laid out there. And then all you need are to come up with the methods to do each of those steps. And methods to do each of those actually exist in living spiritual traditions. But the caveat that I would offer is that a spiritual path is a single coherent entity, a process, a living process, if you will. So if you attempt to pick out certain parts of a spiritual path and then put them together in your own little way, chances are it's not really going to work the way you expect, because it's no longer a coherent living process. So that's a problem. The other problem is, and I know this is a controversial assertion, but an authentic spiritual path that leads to Gnosis, in my opinion, requires a teacher or being who's actually done the path and has attained Gnosis, who can then help you point out where you go off the track, correct mistakes, offer advice. And the main reason this is important is because we can't know what Gnosis is.
Right.
We think we can, but that's the problem, because the mind can't actually know it. Gnosis is not a mental phenomenon. It's an full body phenomenon. So you need the one who's attained it to explain it, to demonstrate it, to help you understand what it is, or else, like, that's the goal. But if you don't know what the goal is, how are you going to get there? If you don't have a map and you don't know the name of the place or even what it looks like how do you get there? So you have to have somebody, in my opinion, who knows how to do that already. So I talked about in the beginning how what Pico's described very closely matches the Hasidic Jewish kabbalistic path. In many ways, that path has a living master, a spiritual master who has attained divine union, who can then aid his disciples in trying to do that. There's no substitute for that. And to try to have a spiritual path and attain Gnosis without that, I don't know how one could do it. And I would also like to see examples of it happening, because if you say, well, the Buddha attained enlightenment without a teacher, I'd say, well, how many lives did the Buddha practice with teachers before that? And I would assert it was probably countless lives. But we live in a culture that may not even accept the idea that that's possible. So I don't know how we can have a conversation on it, because the foundational basis of where we're starting is not the same. And then I don't know how you can really arrive at a common ground from there.
I mean, we don't have any reason to think Pico had a living master, and I'm curious whether he, in some sense, thought the angelology could substitute for that. You know, maybe that the cherubim, approached rightly, could fulfill some of that role for him, if he felt like there was something missing in terms of a higher intelligence between him and the divine that he needed to learn from, because he couldn't see it all himself.
Yeah, and I think this is where Christianity as a religious tradition and a spiritual path kind of departs from the norm in terms of what I'm talking about. And the reason I say that is because Christ expressed, I will be your master. Even if I'm not here, I will be your master. And that's legitimate. And I would hypothesize that that's kind of the approach that Pico took, that Christ is the master, Christ is the savior, and I put myself in his hands, and I don't have a living teacher, but I have Christ, and Christ said he'll do it. So I trust, I have faith. And so I think that's kind of what he did. And I think that's what a lot of Christians do. And that's completely correct within their tradition. So yeah, if you're a Christian and you're on an esoteric Christian path, you might take Christ as your master. But I would say that you should think about the fact that the actual esoteric Christian paths, they have a living master also. So that should clue people in that if the esoteric Christians have a living master and Christ, that it would be a good idea for us to have a living master too. But that, that's up. People will make up their own mind on that one.
I've always been charmed by the way Gurdjieff handles it in Beelzebub's Tales, where he talks, there may be these celestial intelligences that already have more beingness than we do, but they can't know what it's like on the grounds, right? They didn't come up through the world, so they're going to make mistakes. They can't really speak to the embodied experience. The only ones who can do that are the ones who were, clothed with immortal life.
Yes. So true.
Did anything change for you in the course of writing this book?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, tremendously. I think I discovered the same thing that Pico did, really, that the mind wants to know. And so we embark on this journey to learn all the things. And then at some point along the way, you come to realize, and when I say you come to realize, I think what happens is you suffer enough that it becomes obvious that learning all the things isn't going to change you and isn't going to make the suffering stop and isn't going to provide you joy and feeling alive. And so then it became clear. And this was interesting because I met my teacher all around the same time. So as I was learning how Pico discovered this, I was discovering it myself through Pico and through this other path. That, yeah, we have to unlearn, unknow, to unbecome to really know the divine. And that involves a lot of work, a lot of practice, a lot of the sacrifice of attention. And yes, to know the divine means to not know beings or beingness at all. And that sounds weird, but it's just how it is. Like perceiving seems to imply being, but it actually doesn't. It seems to, but it really doesn't. Come to find out. Crazy, I know, but that's how it is.
I think that's a beautiful place to end. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, Greg. I like how smoothly we can get into really nuanced and deep spaces together.
Yeah, thank you so much, Layman. It's really a pleasure to speak with you. And I really appreciate the opportunity and the way that you're able to ask questions and really get into the most significant, deepest parts of all of this just almost effortlessly. So thank you.